and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined by two excellent guests today. Firstly, MP for Motherwell and Wishaw, Marion Fellows. Marion, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you, Kenny?
I'm grand. Good to have you. And on the other side, joining us is Liz Saville Roberts, Plaid Cymru Member of Parliament for South Gwynedd. Liz, how are you doing today?
Very well. Lovely to be on the programme. Well,
Excellent.
This
It's a delight to have you. So we start today, as we always do, with our coronavirus statistics update. So this is as of 2 p.m. yesterday. There were 1,009 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Scotland and sadly 6 new reported deaths. A total of 843,449 people in Scotland have been tested. Of those, 805,407 were confirmed negative, 38,042 tests were positive. As of last night, which of course was Friday night, there will of course be new figures today. There were 432 people in hospital last night, 34 of whom were in intensive care. That is a slight increase again in both those numbers. And a total now of 2,550 patients who, with positive tests, have sadly died in Scotland. So that's where we stand just now. And of course, this week we've seen new restrictions introduced in Scotland and across other parts of the UK. Now, Marion, I will come to you in a moment, but Liz, I'd like to come to you first. How are things in Wales? We've had Delith Jewell on the show a couple of times during the pandemic talking to us about the situation in Wales. But from your perspective, how have things been going, and what have been the developments in the last week or two?
Well, the most recent development is for Bangor, the university city in the north of Gwynedd, the same county where my constituency is. It's just been announced since 6 o'clock last night that they've gone into a local lockdown. And one thing that I really welcome is the fact that we're looking at local lockdowns in Wales, because for a constituency or an area like North Wales, where you have some populace, say a city like Bangor, other towns along the north coast, some populous areas, but many, many really rural areas. Actually, one of the really important things about people abiding by the regulations is to make sure that they see that they're relevant to them. So to apply these lockdowns where they really matter most, and not just across people who don't see the point because it's affecting anybody that they know, is a really good thing, a good way forward, I think.
Mm-hmm. And generally speaking, looking at the management of the pandemic, how has the Welsh Government been getting on, do you think?
There's been ups and downs. I think people are concerned that we have so much of the population now in Wales under some form of lockdown, and there's really no sign of how they're going to come out of it. That is a source of concern. But there are some things, and I think what's really interesting with the conversation that we'll have is that there are more people in Wales now than ever before are actually aware that we have our own powers to do things and do things differently. And one source of controversy, of course, has been that within Wales, rightly, I think, in this case, people are not allowed to move beyond their lockdown area for non-essential reasons. So just general shopping or visiting friends or going on holiday are counted as leisure reasons and non-essential. We still have this deeply ironic situation where many of the people who are coming into Wales on holiday are from areas under lockdown in England where the percentage of positive tests is way higher than anything we're experiencing up here in North Wales. And that's a serious question here. People just see that as being unfair.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's been a lot of pushback whenever the First Minister here has suggested any sort of measures at the border. Have you had kind of similar pushback from the media and other parties when things like controls at the border have been discussed?
Well, yes, and of course, and there's a willful, deliberate misunderstanding of the fact that it made the internet. But what we're talking about here is actually perfectly common sense. Why are people from areas of high infection making non-essential journeys whatsoever? I think there are a number of the Tory party who are quite happy with making non-essential journeys, but if they're actually serious about managing a pandemic, then they should be serious about the sort of movements that people are making. Yes, if they have to move, they have to go for jobs or for health reasons, that is fine. But non-essential reasons, that really is in question. And as I was saying, in Wales, it's different, and people see the unfairness between the rules of the two countries.
Now, Marion, coming to you now, the Central Belt, of course, got the worst of it. I mean, partly, obviously, the Central Belt is more densely populated than the rest of the country, so perhaps a spread of the disease is more likely here. How do you feel about the introduction of the new restrictions that the First Minister announced this week? Do you think this is enough? Do you think we should be going further, or are you kind of thinking maybe we need to find some other way of handling things?
Well, I think it's a case of damned if you do and damned if you don't. I think what's been brought in is definitely going to help suppress the virus spread, because it is spreading. I mean, when Glasgow went into lockdown, I think most of us in Lanarkshire, where I am, thought, well, we won't be, far behind, because it is almost one huge conurbation. And we need to do something. And I think what's being done at the moment is to try and do the least harm to people's mental health, the least harm to businesses, but we still need to get hold of this. Is a virus that kills people. And if we let it spread exponentially again, then more people are going to die, and that's not what anyone wants.
We've seen some people in the hospitality industry reacting quite badly to this. We saw the protests outside the city chambers in Glasgow, for example, with dumping all this ice. I wonder, do you have a lot of sympathy there, or do you think perhaps there's a sense in Scotland that, well, is alcohol really that important to us?
Well, I'm not going to answer that alcohol is important to everyone in Scotland, but definitely people do become less inhibited when they consume alcohol. I'm a classic example. I would never stand up and sing, but and that's funny, but it's far more serious than that. It's just little slippages, and before you know it, you're less than a metre apart in a hospitality area, or less than 2 metres apart outside, or all of that really counts. I think hospitality, if we're going to keep open and universities open, which I think is absolutely essential because of the knock-on effect, especially schools have on people with business. I have family who were trying to do full-time jobs with children and home education. Now that isn't working. It's not good for children. The children were getting very upset. We're becoming more and more difficult to talk to rationally because, they missed their friends. They wanted to do stuff. So if we want to keep schools and universities open, we have to really think carefully where the virus is spreading. And if you have large crowds of people, then that's going to be more of an area. So football, for example, isn't, bingo halls have closed locally. All of that is really just to dry up to try and dry up the spread of of COVID. It won't be perfect. It won't clear it out completely, but it will slow the rate of transmission and therefore slow the rate of admissions to hospitals.
And when you look at that balance, as you say, between people's sort of mental well-being and ability to just live something like a normal life versus the risk of the pandemic, do you feel like perhaps there needs to be a kind of bigger shift in how we're thinking about this as a society, that maybe people in general are not taking things quite as seriously as they need to?
I think undoubtedly there are people who are not taking this as seriously as they should. But, there's a long tradition in Scotland of the common weal. It's not just about me, it's not just about you, it's about everyone. And if we work together and think about each other, then that's got to go a long way to helping. I mean, I'm one of the people who live on their own. It's not easy. I have family quite close by, and that's okay. But at the same time, if I was just to say, well, I'm fed up, I'm going out, I'm going wherever I want, I've had enough, then I think I couldn't live with myself. It would be on my conscience that I had broken the rules and had perhaps inadvertently helped spread COVID-19 across family and friends. There's a very good ad out just now with the young woman making a cup of tea for her grandfather. And I don't know if you've seen it, but that brought home to me more clearly than anything I've listened to or seen recently just how easy it is to spread this. And we all have a part to play. We all can help, and we all should try to do the best we can to make
Now,
sure.
Liz, if I could come back to you, one of the things that's been discussed a lot in Scotland is the difference in the style of messaging between Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish government versus Boris Johnson and the UK government. The First Minister obviously has been out every day explaining her decisions, taking responsibility for the situation in Scotland. We've not seen that from the UK government. I wonder, has there been the same kind of contrast in Wales?
I think it's a little bit like I'm being highly supportive of Welsh Government, but I think at this time it is, as Marion was saying, actually what we do and how we talk about this really matters. It will affect how people respond. Mark Drakeford, of course, has gone about this. Mark Drakeford is the First Minister of Wales in a completely different way to Boris Johnson. You see Boris Johnson putting out government initiatives, government announcements through his favoured press sources. Now, for us in Wales, of course, this is quite a problem because we don't have the same national press, national media that you have in Scotland. Now, I know that my SNP colleagues will have a definite opinion about certain providers of media in Scotland, but the simple truth is that people in Scotland hear Scotland being discussed and are used to going to Scottish media far more than people are in Wales. We've only got 2 daily papers. One of them is effectively a local paper, and the BBC, at times at the beginning of the emergency, actually dropped some of its bulletins. Now, although Mark Drakeford has been endeavouring to get information out, I really suspect that actually the difficulty in getting messages through and the conflicting messages, the competition between hearing what's coming through from England has actually affected some of what Welsh Government feel that they can do meaningfully, which is a pretty appalling situation to be in. And I hope that as we move ahead, that looking at, nation of Wales, our Parliament, if we can't carry out certain actions because we can't get those messages through, we need to think about how we can actually ensure that the media works to best effect for us. But no, that's been an ongoing question. And one of the things that one of my roles in Westminster is just to remind Boris Johnson sometimes that he's actually talking as the Prime Minister for England on all health matters, and to make sure that the message is conveyed clearly, because there are real differences according to different needs of different nations.
Yeah, I wonder, you did mention earlier that more people in Wales have become aware of what the Welsh Government does and how big its responsibilities are. Do you think that there's still a problem with that coming from London, from Whitehall, and from Fleet Street, where both the UK media and government still don't quite get how devolution's meant to work?
Yeah. It's very interesting that the government seems to have a policy now of referring to the devolved administrations as though the administrations were just there for some sort of managerial role, some sort of technocratic role of rolling out the things that Westminster are telling them to do. They're not, of course, they're devolved governments. And let's remember the difference between the terminology. Government means that there are policies, on which the governments are leading, in which they're pushing forward. Administration implies that they're just there passing on other policies. Now, we're seeing this in other aspects of Westminster, of course, as well. I'm sure we'll go on to talk about the UK Internal Market Bill, possibly, or some of the implications. But we're looking at a government that in Westminster that's eyeing up devolution and looking for where they can get the fights and where they can get the political fights, and using the difference in approaches over coronavirus. We do see these arguments. We're seeing arguments happening. Health in Wales is very much used as political football by the Westminster government. I mean, we're also seeing it with the UK Internal Market Bill, of course, with the way that Westminster is now deciding or giving itself the power to spend in certain ways, which we can only reckon really will be quite political and probably be used to favour the Tory government.
Now, Marion, to come back to you on this, the media in Scotland have spent a lot of time discussing how confusing the regulations are. Now, admittedly, there was a little bit of complexity in the First Minister's announcement this week, the distinction between a cafe and a restaurant and all that kind of thing. But do you think the media have helped matters in discussing these confusing regulations by not making a clear enough distinction between what's happening in England as decided by the UK government and what's happening in Scotland as decided at Holyrood.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the media and Scottish media have a bigger role to play in making sure that the message gets across. And I think they're looking for stories, they're looking for dissent, they're looking for something that will make their headlines a bit, I suppose the word is sexier than it would be than First Minister has said that, and what's the difference between a cafe and a restaurant? As the First Minister said, if you run a cafe or a restaurant, you know the difference. It's not that difficult. And where there has been confusion, the Scottish Government has been very quick to try and put out their updated versions and make sure that people do understand. But you don't necessarily get the explanations that you would expect to see in mainstream media. And that's really, really disturbing, because it's not a good story to put up the bad news. It's not a good story. It's a better story if you have a bone of contention that you can play with in the meantime.
And just generally, the media obviously have been questioning the First Minister almost every day throughout the pandemic. Do you feel that there is perhaps a responsibility on the media to be more accurate, to be more just straight up and down with the news? I guess you would agree with that.
Well, yes, of course I would. But I mean, it's to Nicola's credit that she stands there days now and gives out the news, says what's happening, and tries to explain it, and treats people like adults. And I think that's the real difference. When you listen to someone like Nicola or Mark Vayford actually speaking to their constituents across the different nations, it's in total contrast to the way Boris Johnson speaks. It's almost as if, I want to be your friend, if I won't tell you anything nasty, here's two scientists I can blame, now let's all be friends. And that's not how to deal with issues during a pandemic. It's putting lives at risk.
Liz, with the distinction between the UK and the devolved governments, do you have any concerns about the way the BBC and specifically has responded to this? I've noticed a number of times, for example, they elide the difference between England and the UK when they're talking about statistics, for example. Do you think that's a problem? And do you think there's something that the BBC could do, perhaps under a new Director General, that might improve that kind of reporting?
Well, I think one of the things that we saw early on in the emergency, of course, the BBC actually not covering, not broadcasting some of their, some at some of their normal times from Wales, because they said they hadn't got the staff to do it. Then we've seen the First Minister or the Health Minister for Wales, Vaughan Gethings, their broadcast sometimes getting cut off in mid-sentence even. And there is a clear duty on the part of the state broadcaster to make sure that people know exactly what the regulations are in their particular areas. And that is a clear demand, I would say, back to the BBC. I mean, at the same time, of course, we've got so much less control. We have less, even for the BBC hours that they broadcast in Wales are less than you see in Scotland. I do know that there's quite a question about how the BBC covers matters there as well. But that point that I made about the degree that a government can actually make decisions, whether that's being influenced by their concerns that they can't get those messages through, is a really fundamental problem. Welsh Government should be able to approach the BBC and say, how are you going to help us to make sure that we get the messaging through? But having said that, this is the interesting thing, of course, looking towards attitudes towards more powers, towards independence in Wales. Having said all these points, I have no doubt that people are way more aware now that health matters are treated differently in Wales to how they're treated in England. And I live in an area where we get many visitors here. This is a conversation that we have about how people should behave when they're here, how they should know the differences, and how do we actually say that.
Well, we'd recommend very much that you create a broadcasting Wales just like this, because that's the only way you're going to do better, from our experience with the BBC in Scotland. But we will move on now a wee bit. And we'll go across the Atlantic, where this week we've seen a number of interesting developments in the US presidential campaign. Donald Trump, of course, was admitted and then released from hospital, claims to be in the best of health now, absolutely feeling better than he ever has. Still, of course, not able to campaign, and he's withdrawn from the next debate with Joe Biden. This week we also saw a debate between Kamala Harris, the Democratic vice presidential nominee, and Mike Pence, the current vice president. So Liz, I think I'll come to you first on this. What's been your feeling about how the presidential election has developed in the last week? Do you think the coronavirus will be a fatal blow to the campaign, if not to Donald Trump himself?
I mean, the trouble with discussing the US presidential campaign is what I think that many people desperately wish for, and actually making a guess on what the polls are going to say are two very different things. Now, there is no alternative universe in which I have any wish to see another President Trump imposed on the US or on the world for the next 4 years. I'm greatly afraid that my desire to see all the indications working in that direction, all the signs pointing to that as a prediction, could slightly blind me to anything else. And many of us predicted this last time round, that no way that Trump could win. So that's me being really cautious to begin with, because we desperately, I desperately don't want to see this going on any longer than is possible. Having put all that sort of caution to one side, we are looking at polls. It seems to be that the postal votes are not likely to be doing many favours for Trump. And I think what we saw in the vice presidential debate this week, once again, was this two extraordinarily different Americas. The America that did bring us Barack Obama, that could well bring us Kamala Harris as the next vice president. Who knows, when we're looking at somebody 78 years of age, with Joe Biden, we're looking at the next American president even. These are really exciting times, but at the same time, we've still got Mike Pence there, and I think that Trump supporters are very sticky.
Now, of course, Trump and Pence have both been accused of interrupting a lot. In fact, well, not accused, they did interrupt a lot in both debates. Marion, I wonder what you made of Kamala Harris at the debate, and her ability to just shut Mike Pence up when she was speaking. I mean, she did say a couple of times, I'm speaking now. What did you make of that in terms of just how women and often, just anybody to the left of Trump and his ilk get treated by their political opponents?
I mean, I hate to say this, but it's not just an American phenomenon. That it has happened quite frequently in Westminster for Ian Blackford, who gets shouted down all the time, as do many of us whenever we stand up to speak and to say that things are different in Scotland and that it's better. And that message does not resonate. I think Kamala Harris was a fantastic choice as a vice presidential candidate. And it's not just a box ticking exercise, although, that's how I think I saw it at first. But she has the strength and the character to face down. To get to where she has been in US politics shows a strength of character and a way of presenting yourself and holding yourself in public office that really bodes well. It's funnily enough, and I don't want to go off too much what you've been saying, but I've been talking, messaging and talking to a couple of Americans that I would have thought, little I knew of them, that they would be so anti-Trump it would not be true. But actually, they're coming always back to the economy and that things got better under Trump, and there's a great belief that it might continue to happen. And that's a great worry, because Trump has so much positive media and also tweets and speaks directly to people. And what Liz has said, Trump has great stickability. with the people who supported him last time. They don't seem to care what he does or what happens. He's their man and they're going to stick by him. Kamala Harris would actually, I think, make a fantastic vice president. We're talking about vice presidents, but they're not seen really in the race normally in the States, but this is like a presidential election like no other. And there is maybe a shift to thinking, well, and I don't want to use the word old because, I'm in that age range myself. These are older men. We need to look at what might happen if something happens to them. And I think then Kamala Harris would probably gain more votes for Biden than not. Pence is Trump too. And again, that's probably going. I don't think anyone can call this election yet. What does worry me is if Trump wins, that's one thing to be worried about. But if he loses, I think we're into a whole new ballgame. And that worries me. That absolutely worries me, especially with the whole thing about postal votes, which he has already started to say they can't be right, they're cheating, there's all sorts of issues with them. What's he going to do if he doesn't win and then calls on his so-called allies in private militia armies across the states? What's going to happen then?
Yeah, Liz, there's been a lot of talk about this so-called blue shift that might happen, where on the day, the votes cast on the day could well lean towards Trump, and then the postal votes being counted in the days afterwards are going to shift it back to Biden, who may well win quite a convincing victory, but by then Trump will have undermined the narrative so badly that it's going to be very difficult for people to accept that Biden's won. Do you think that's a real concern?
Well, it seems that it certainly seems to be suiting Trump to be talking up concern about the postal votes now and to be talking up again his base support. What this will say, when we come to be looking back on this period in the history books, what the inheritance that Trump will have left to Western democracies remain to be seen. But he is playing a deeply irresponsible and dangerous game.
Well, we will obviously keep watching. That election takes place on the 3rd of November, but votes are already underway across much of the US. But we move on now, and we come back to the UK, where we are still just a couple of months away from the end of the Brexit transition period, with still no deal in place. And the British government has urged businesses to prepare for the end of the transition, saying that they need to take action whether or not a trade deal is clinched. The UK had set a deadline of October the 15th, which is obviously this week, in order to get a deal done. I think a lot of people agree that that's not necessarily the hardest deadline, that there will be possibilities to keep negotiating after that and possibly negotiate a lot more intensively. But Marion, if I come to you first, isn't it a bit rich for the UK government to tell businesses you need to get prepared for what's going to happen on January the 1st when still nobody has any detail on what is going to happen?
Yes, it is very rich. But then it's indicative of what's been happening all the way through the Brexit process, and especially since with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. The easiest deal in history, all of that stuff, and we're still where we are. Now, I agree with you, Kenny, that the negotiations are not over yet. But when the UK government hasn't put out any firm guidance, and all we get is briefings in the Sunday Times and the Telegraph about what might be happening, and lorry parks, thousands of lorries outside Dover, and no deal on fishing, which would really, and I'm not thinking here of East Coast trawlers, of course, they're important. I'm thinking West Coast people who do seafood. They don't know what's happening. And for the UK government to say they need to prepare, yes, I'm sure they're desperate to prepare, but without guidance from the government as to what is likely to happen, they're going to spend so much time, effort, and money on preparing for something that may or may not happen. And that's why we need far more clarity and far more upfront decisions from the UK government and upfront guidance, which is sadly lacking even yet.
I mean, we've heard from a number of industry bodies that basically it's too late now for them to make transition arrangements because they just don't have the lead time to do that. What have businesses in your constituency been saying to you about this? Are they in that kind of position where it doesn't matter what the guidance is now, it's just too late?
They're doing their best. Yes, it is. It's for detail. Businesses which survive in not just Brexit, but we've got the pandemic as well, are the ones that are light on their feet, can change, can do things. So this is really important that businesses actually know what they're trying to do. Each business is now doing something slightly different because there is no one has any idea. And of course here we have a lot of trade with Northern Ireland as well. So all of that factored into the mix, and I'm saying missed, probably missed or mixed. It is not helping businesses in any size, shape or form to see a way forward and do the very best they can to make sure that they can continue after Brexit and during the pandemic. It's a mess. It's a mess, and industry bodies are saying that and have been saying that since almost 2016, and no one seems to have actually got a grip on this. And that's down to successive Tory governments. And I'm not a great believer in putting all the blame somewhere else, but if you're not in charge of what's going on as a government and you're still waiting to sort things out, then that filters down as absolutely no use to businesses to try and plan. They got caught out in the pandemic with stockpiling. They got caught out with various different things during prep for Brexit by stockpiling as well. So they're loath to spend money. And a lot of businesses are sitting on their heels waiting to see what happens and whether or not they will survive. It's as dangerous a mix as that at the moment.
Now, just before I turn to Liz on this, the Scottish Government this week rejected a legislative consent motion, meaning that they don't accept the UK Government's right to legislate on the internal market bill because they haven't given permission. What do you make of that, and what do you think are going to be the consequences of that refusal of the legislative consent?
Well, that is a huge question. I mean, I think it was the right decision. I think it was cross-party in the Scottish. I think that's to the credit of the Scottish Parliament. But what's going to happen? Who knows? Because Boris Johnson can and will enact laws with his majority. The only hope we have is that the Red Wall Tories wake up and see what's actually happening. And there's a lot of synchronicity between Scotland and the north of England in terms of the kind of economies they have, in terms of the history of mass unemployment and how that's going to affect constituencies in the north of England. We just have to wait and see. We have to hope that someone in the UK government actually realises what they're doing, but I don't hold out any great hope. I think unless you sit in the chamber in Westminster, and I know I haven't done that for a wee while, and listen to Tories going on about how great Britannia is, how we're world leaders, how we're going to build back better, most of it is rhetoric. The major failing of this government, I think, has been the failure to plan for different scenarios. Now, Boris Johnson can and will go forward and do what he thinks is right, which I just totally disagree with. But there's no way in a democratic parliament to stop him. If he can whip his supporters to vote with him, then that's what will happen. I don't want it to happen, but I'm realistic that is what's going. All we can do is keep pressing him to understand what he is doing, because sometimes he's been known to U-turn based on pressure from people. And my big hope here would be that the Red Wall Tories actually understand what he's doing, because I think there are many people, and I still believe that there are many people who think Brexit is done when actually we're still in the transition period and nothing has really changed. And when things change, there's going to be a huge intake of breath when people actually realise the consequences of the 2016 vote.
Mm. Well, Liz, the internal market bill obviously affects all of the devolved governments. I wonder, what's been the reaction to it in Wales? We saw here that every party in the Scottish Parliament, except for the Tories, voted against that legislative consent motion. Is there a similar movement in the Senate?
Very, very similar. We've got the adamantly unionist parties in the Tories and in the what remains of the Brexit representatives in the Assembly, who will always be arguing on those points. But I mean, let's remember exactly what's in the withdrawal agreement legislation. In seeking consent, all the UK government has to do, in effect, actually is give the devolved governments, the devolved parliaments, the opportunity to talk about something. What the actual decision is made legally has no consequence whatsoever.
Mm. So what's been the political response here? Has there been a lot of cut through with the Welsh public and Welsh businesses about this? We've seen obviously a lot of concern here in our food and drink industry. Are Welsh lamb farmers just as concerned as Scotch lamb farmers?
Well, I think there's 2 points here. We were talking earlier on about the lorry parks. There's been there's been sites allocated, identified in England. There's been no sites identified in Wales, and 2 sites, one in the south and of course one up in the north in Holyhead, which is extremely important for all Irish traffic, not just from the Republic, from the north as well. Mm-hmm. And there's been no site identified for lorries yet. The only one that was being discussed so far would have involved all the lorries going through a series of villages off the main road, which obviously just is not going to be possible. So the lack of preparation for the haulage industry, and then you look at specific areas like this in Wales, is it's beyond understanding. We've been through the same discussions over a year ago as well. We've been rolling around on these conversations year after year after year and still go forward. But I was talking yesterday to a farmer in my constituency, and this is an upland constituency, great dependence on raising livestock, particularly Welsh Mountain lamb. They are a certain breed, they're a certain size. There isn't that much market for Welsh Mountain lamb in the United Kingdom as things stand. And they don't know whether there will be tariffs for selling into their major markets in Europe yet. And of course, for farmers, you can't just chop and change fleet of foot overnight. You have to decide whether there are going to be more lambs next year. And this uncertainty, again, this has been dragging on for years. And we're still in this position. And the Tories just tell us everything's going to be okay. But I mean, the other really significant point here as well, actually, if we're talking about the trade negotiations with Europe, is that we know that papers about state aid, relating to state aid, were held back from the devolved governments because they knew that they would be controversial. The lack of faith and the ongoing steps to make the lack of faith worse and worse and worse. I don't really see how this government anticipates this is going to end well from the point of view of the union.
Mm-hmm. And how is the Welsh government responding to this? Is this, I mean, we know Labour here have been against the internal market bill, or at least haven't been willing to give it legislative consent. I assume the Welsh government is thinking the same thing. How hard are they fighting it though?
I'm afraid in detail I can't answer you for that, but it is fair to say that Jeremy Miles, the Attorney General for Wales, has spoken against the UK internal market bill. They see that it takes powers back. They're concerned about many aspects of it. It's a pity they're not backed up more strongly by their colleagues in Westminster.
Mm-hmm. Now, we are just going to come on to talk about Welsh independence and stuff, so I suppose that makes the point. Do you think what you said earlier about people becoming more aware of the devolved competencies of the role of the Welsh Parliament and the Welsh government, combined with this news about the internal market bill trying to bulldoze through those devolved responsibilities, do you think that is driving a change in the way people in Wales think about independence?
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt, brought it far more into the public eye. And then there's been fantastic development of Yes Cymru over the last 3 years. And so people are aware now in a way that they never were previously that the rules are different in Wales. For some people, that becomes a charged question and they regard it as an offence against the union, if you like, or offence of where they feel that decisions should be made. But people have actually seen that this could affect their lives, does affect their lives, and they see the potential for affecting their lives for better. Now, since I've been actively involved in politics, I think you can track, within the last decade, the interest in independence. You had a core interest of, say, perhaps 6%, gradually rising up, more and more polls this year, a series of 5 or so polls this year by Salvation and YouGov. And you're seeing consistently a response of around about 33%, about a third actively interested to the point of being more supportive, being supportive of independence. But it's really over the summer when people actually were asking the question. There was a Salvation poll over the summer, YouGov poll over the summer, which specifically asked, were you against independence, which came back with 36%. The people who were indie curious and indie confident, between them those who respond, you were getting up to 64%. So it's being talked about far more than ever before. And my party, Plaid Cymru, in preparation for next year's Senedd elections, brought forward a commission on independence, or what the steps should be. Now, we see that we're in the position, say, looking back to 2014 in Scotland, the way that the discussion just took off with that referendum and in the period that followed. We're behind that, evidently, in Wales. We're back possibly in that phase then, those sorts of statistical figures, that sort of data coming back. So what we feel here, there will be a different approach to what, where you are now in Scotland, is we need to make this discussion much stronger. We need a formalised commission, which if Plaid Cymru has the power to do so next spring, we'll set up, with citizens' assemblies to discuss the model of what independence would actually mean. What are the different options that are available to people? We need to make sure that the discussion rolls on so that we're ready for a proper referendum as a second stage, possibly, actually to ask people, do we move ahead with this?
Now, as you say, the Welsh movement is a little bit behind where the Scottish movement has been for the last few years. How quickly do you think that could change? I mean, is it a realistic possibility that Plaid could win the election next year and be proposing a referendum inside the next term of the Welsh Parliament?
Well, what Plaid's been talking about is a two-stage referendum, so that if we do have the sufficient power, and it is a three-horse race very much in Wales for the Senedd for next year, to take the first stage forward, a referendum on the different options that Wales could be considering, alongside working with citizens' assemblies and a formal independent commission, that then will take the debate to the next stage. Now, from my point of view, I would like the next stage to come as soon as possible, but I'm very aware that to do this through legitimate democratic means, we need to talk to way more people in way more detail and reach people who've never thought about this before, for this to be a realistic option democratically and legitimately. So there is a stage process. We're an earlier stage. You must remember, of course, in Wales that we don't have the institutions. We don't have a separate legal jurisdiction. We don't have many of the institutions that you have in Scotland. We're building these and strengthening these. But we're doing it at an incredibly fast rate. The acceleration since 1999 for Wales and the discussions that we're holding now, these are discussions that had much wider hearing in Scotland for a much longer period. I hope and will work towards a continuation of that acceleration.
Well, come to you now, Marion. We are going to talk in a moment about polling in Scotland, but when you look at the Welsh movement and the developments that the Welsh independence movement has made in the last few years, does that give you a sense of pride that they've kind of taken inspiration from Scotland, or is it more of a kind of inspiration to see how much they've been able to achieve so quickly?
I think it's both, really. I will always be grateful to the Plaid folk who came out and helped us in 2014. I was quite amazed and surprised at how willing they were to come and help us during our referendum. I think that the one thing that's come out of COVID I think, and it's already been referred to, and Liz has talked about it, is that people in Wales now realise they have a government, even though it may be talked down by the UK government. They now understand that they have the control over some of their own affairs in a way that possibly wasn't as common knowledge in Wales. Now, in Scotland, right going back to when we had the votes for whether or not we would have a Scottish Parliament, we've always been, and the polling has always shown that people like the fact that we have a Scottish Parliament and that we can do things differently. And I think that's really why Wales is moving forward, and all the work that Plaid has been doing since 1999 as well. I think people now in both countries see an alternative in a way that they didn't. There's always been a strong underpinning of Scottish nationalism in Scotland. But since the referendum, especially, things have grown. And although people, the poll that was out today, people have shifted from yes to no, but more people have shifted from no to yes since 2014. And that's really an important fact. And the fact that we can see that the Scottish Government does things differently and more in line with what the Scottish people want is going to eventually lead to us getting independence. I see no path other now than towards independence.
Mm-hmm. Now, that poll published today by Survation shows that 64% of Scots believe that Scotland would vote yes in a second referendum, and 56% of people asked said an independence referendum should go ahead if a pro-Indy majority is in the Scottish Parliament after the election next year. Marion, how much difference do you think it makes when almost 2/3 of people in Scotland think that independence is coming whether they want it or not?
I think that's the key, isn't it? The fact that 2/3 think Scotland will have a referendum and the people will vote yes. And that's us on a path we have never trodden before. Mm-hmm. I can remember the feeling in 2014 on the Sunday before the actual referendum day when yes was in the lead. And there was that moment of, oh my goodness, have we done it? Have we done it? And almost panic. There's no panic now. This is a path we've been on as a country for a long while now. And I think it's an inevitability. And I think it will happen, whether or not Boris Johnson thinks it will or not, or whether or not the UK government wants it. We go back to the argument that in Scotland the people are sovereign, and if that's what the majority of people in Scotland want, then that's what should and will happen.
Mm-hmm. And that majority saying that the independence referendum should go ahead if the Parliament has that support for it, that's a bit of a change as well. I mean, there's always been an abstract sense that people believe that the Scottish Parliament should have powers, but when you get down to the nitty-gritty of should we be able to hold a referendum, people have been a bit more dubious. Do you think that change is going to make a difference politically when it comes to whatever discussions have to be had with the UK government?
Yes, I think so, because there's not a country has gained its independence from the UK that didn't actually do it legitimately and with the blessing, I suppose you could say, of the UK. There is an inevitability. And I think even though Boris Johnson himself personally doesn't want to be the Prime Minister in charge of the breakup of the Union, and I get that, he has to bow to what the people in Scotland want. You can even see changes, subtle changes in the Tory party in Scotland. They are accepting some things now. They're starting to move backwards. I mean, the crazy one is on university fees. Now, nobody really believes a lot of what they're putting out just now. They think it's, a good idea to have free tuition for students when they fought against it so long. These, like the Scottish Tories and Scottish Labour, are actually will have to reposition themselves because, as you say, 2/3 of the people in Scotland think that Scotland is perfectly capable of running its own affairs and that we shouldn't be always tied to the tailcoat of the UK government. And parties within Scotland have a different approach to things. And that's come about because of the shift in population thought on independence.
Liz, just to come back to you quickly, when you look at the Scottish movement and the potential that there might be an independence referendum as soon as next year, what difference do you think that will make to the movement in Wales, given that we see with the internal market bill more and more centralising of power, this British nationalist project of Brexit? Do you think if Scotland were to vote for independence, do you think that would make things better or worse for the movement in Wales?
I think it will polarise. I think it's entirely fair to say that for many in the independence movement in Wales, that Scotland has been a constant inspiration. I joined a lot of people from this area, from my immediate community, who arranged a bus up to Glasgow in January, and we stood in the rain. I think I was recorded by you, maybe
Yep.
at the same time, this time then as well. People are far more alert and switched on to both sides of the argument in Wales. But then, of course, those people who are resisting the thought of more powers, which moves inevitably towards independence. You can't. There is no. It's almost like a series of valves. Once you go through one, you go through to the next. But if you're going to start arguing to move back, and there are some, I mean, this is where the Brexit and the UKIPers have morphed into this now. Mm-hmm. You're always arguing basically that we can't do it for some reason. We shouldn't even be thinking to aspire to be wealthy enough, to be confident enough, to be able to take on responsibility for ourselves sufficiently. You're always arguing that people should be satisfied with an inferior condition, that we can't do it. And that's a very difficult argument to keep hold of. Once you turn it on its head and be positive, why shouldn't we be seeking more powers? Why shouldn't we be seeking the way to use our powers more effectively? Mm. And this has been talked about by more and more people. It's mattered to them. It's not just an abstract politicians talking about some stuff, stuff amongst themselves, and people who like to talk about politics talking about it amongst themselves. People have actually seen with COVID how this affects their lives, and they're switched on then. Much has happened, I think, in the referendum in 2014 in Scotland. They're switched on then to how politics does this by the UK internal market, by the withdrawal bill, by the nature of the trade agreements.
Mm. Well, Liz, we are out of time. I think that is a wonderful place to end, though. So, Liz, Saville Roberts, thank you so much for your perspective from Wales, and Marion, with your perspective from Wishy. Thank you both for joining us. It has been a pleasure. Thank you at home for joining us as well. There would be no point in us making these shows if we didn't have an audience for them. So thank you so much. We do have to ask, if you're able to support us here at Broadcasting Scotland, then do please go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register. Sign up there as a supporter, and your £5 a month is what helps us keep the lights on here. So do please support us if you can. If you're not able to support us financially, we do understand. The shows will always be free to view online, but you can still do us a big favour by following us on Twitter at Broadcast Scot, by liking our Facebook page, and by subscribing to our YouTube channel, and then sharing these shows around with your friends, your family, whoever random strangers you may meet, although you're not supposed to under current restrictions. So just let people know why you support us. It makes a big difference to have that personal recommendation from you to encourage people to support us. And finally, we are always looking for new volunteers here. We're running on a skeleton staff just now, partly because of the pandemic, partly because it's just been difficult for us to get some more people in to help out. So if you're willing to come and help us out here, learn some new skills, maybe polish up some old skills, then we would love to have you either in front of the camera or behind. There are lots of jobs to be done. So do please get in touch if you're interested in that. That is absolutely all we have time for today, though. So thank you once again to Liz Saville Roberts and Marion Fellows. Gordon will be back again tomorrow at 7 with Scotland at 7. I will be back in my regular slot on Tuesday evening. But until then, thanks again for watching and have a great Sunday. Goodbye.